afternoon. You guys look intimidating after lunch. Just looking at your faces. Thanks so much for your appearance here at this training. This is what we look forward to all year long, and it's been great to finally see everybody face to face. As she said, I'm Vera Hailey. I was a local magistrate for 22 years before I retired in 2018, and I have remained actively involved in court work. The topic of civil commitments, I think, is very relevant. It's very important. It's estimated in the U.S. 1 of 5 adults has a mental illness every year. So if you look around, think about the size of this room. If you're at a table of 5, y'all can do the math as you're looking around. What do you think? I see people pointing at other people, saying it's not me. You guys are professionals. What is the most prevalent mental illness in the older population? Depression. There are some other things that are up near the top 2, but depression is it. So how many of you are 100% confident in knowing how to assist someone who's having a mental health crisis? Show of hands. I know some of you do this sometimes, often. Nobody knows. You really need to be here today. Law enforcement, James, I know you know. Yeah. So I think this will be extremely relevant. We have assembled the dream team. These folks are all components of the system when you get to mental health commitments, but we're never ever in the same room at the same time. So this is kind of a big deal for us. This is a historic moment. More information on our faculty bios is in your information. But just briefly, representing law enforcement is Captain Rebecca Becky Meeks from Waynesboro Police Department. So locally, I don't know of any other more well-known law enforcement person. She has been around a long time. In fact, fun fact, we went to elementary school together. We cheer, yeah, we cheerleaded. From the judicial branch is my favorite sitting magistrate, Magistrate Judith Owens. And people believe a magistrate can do anything. They never sleep, they can answer any question, they can do anything they want unchecked. So we'll see what Magistrate Owens has to say about all that. Pre-screener extraordinaire is Michelle Beverly from Valley Community Services Board. She is also the judicial liaison, so it's perfect that she's here today. Last but not least, we have a real live special justice with us today. He's awake, he's alert, he's in a good mood, even though he doesn't look like he's in a good mood. That's just how he looks. And the other 2 local justices look very similar to him, except he has the most aggressive beard of the 3. Let's have a guess. How many total years of professional experience do you think is represented here with us 5? Somebody guess. 144. Yes. Our main focus, of course, today is going to be on mental health emergency custody orders, ECOs, and mental health temporary detention orders, or TDOs, which are judicial officer issued processes. If someone has behavior or language that indicates they're in a mental health crisis, it can be an initiation or a reinstatement of treatment. And it can also be an alternative to a criminal justice process. Related civil rights issues that this obviously brings up, it's a curtailment of the respondent's civil rights. We have to balance the benefits of initiating mental health treatment by judicial order with safeguards built into the system to ensure the least restrictive measures are being used. There's also constitutional protection against the loss of liberty without judicial process. So it's very serious stuff to consider. But today we want to look at a composite case study, and the social workers out there will be trying to figure out if we use part of your case or if you know these people. But it's based on real life things that have happened, but we have changed the names and some of the circumstances. Meet Dorothy Jones. She is 74 years old and she lives alone in a rancher home in a neighborhood with mainly middle-aged and older people. Her husband died a few years ago. She has no children. She does have a nephew in another state, but they are estranged. The neighbors in her neighborhood look out for one another. Dan Cooper, who's lived in her same block for about 8 years, has known Dorothy all of his life. She taught his sister in school. Dan saw Dorothy in mid-January on 2 consecutive nights walking in her yard. On the second night, he went over to see if he could help with something, to see what was going on, and he could plainly see that she was in a thin nightgown, no shoes, and she was shouting for Bowser. Come Bowser. Well, he knew that her dog Bowser had been hit by a car and killed the previous year. Dan took her by the arm and he could feel that she had definitely lost weight recently. Her hair was matted and she was one of those bouffanted, well-coiffed, hairdo kind of good neighbor ladies that many of you might recognize. As he walked her to the door, she grabbed the door handle. She would not let him over the threshold, but he could smell the stench of rotting food, and he could see that the kitchen doorway was blocked by black trash bags. She slammed the door in his face. Early the next morning, Dan got up and called 2 of the neighbors to find out if they knew what was going on with Dorothy. And one neighbor from across the street had seen her recently piling up household items out of the alley. So when the neighbor went over to ask if there was a yard sale in the works, Dorothy shouted to her to stay in her own yard. Dan knew Dorothy's longtime friend Susan, who used to help her with yard work. He gave Susan a call, and Susan was surprised to hear about Dorothy's situation. She had not been in contact because they had gotten into a crazy argument about mulch, and Dorothy wouldn't talk to her. Dan went back to Dorothy's, knocked, identified himself. She would not come to the door. She shouted, "Go away." Dan then called the police department non-emergency number and described Dorothy's troubling and out-of-character behavior. Captain Meeks.
Sorry, I'm not a sit-down kind of person. So this is where then law enforcement comes into play. Basically, this call would come to us through dispatch as basically a welfare check is kind of how it starts out as. So in this particular situation, the responding officer, we very hard try to assign what's called a CIT officer to do these type of calls. Most of the officers in Waynesboro are CIT trained. Also, I know in Augusta, CIT trained, Stanton. We try to keep a certain percentage of our officers trained. At one point, it was almost 90%. So you send a CIT officer out there. The CIT officer is basically trained in communication skills. You know, as a law enforcement, we had to really get away from, you know, just the facts, ma'am, typo. You know, be human, ask people's names, tell them your name, that type of stuff. So there's a whole lot, it's a 40-hour course to become a CIT instructor. So it's pretty extensive training, and then they get a lot of training from Valley Community Services boards, magistrates. It's quite extensive for 40 hours. So we try to send a CIT officer to do that type of welfare check if at all possible. The officer goes to the house to check on Dorothy. Dorothy's car's there. Car's in the driveway around the tag. It's her car. It's her only way around. Knock, knock, knock on the door. Dorothy won't come to the door. All right? So pretty typical with a lot of situations dealing with the elderly. What we have done, and I've done it plenty of times, I will then call my lovely APS friends, and I'll be like, Lindsay, do you know Dorothy Jones? And Lindsay will be, let me check. And she'll be like, yeah, I think I do. You know, we have her in the database, and so-and-so, give me a name. Who's the worker? Pick somebody. Taylor was her worker. And, you know, Taylor had dealt with her. She had gotten off her bipolar medication. She had done a great job, found someone to help her, got her back on her medication. Everything was good, and then kind of that ended the case for that particular point. So, because she's such a great CPS worker, and in reality, she and I have done this a lot, we say, we're going to go out there together, and we're going to check on Dorothy. Because a lot of times, I mean, this is a team, and that's all about CIT too. It's teamwork. We're all in this together. We also often are dealing with the same clientele. So maybe Dorothy will open the door for Taylor because she knows Taylor helped her out in the past. So you build those relationships because Dorothy doesn't know me. I haven't dealt with her before. So me and Taylor, we go over there together. All right? When we arrive, what we find is we see for our own selves, Miss Dorothy, she is in the front yard. She is in her very thin nightgown without her shoes, just like this neighbor had explained. She has thrown away a very nice antique chair. It's in the alley, like ready to be picked up. I mean, there's nothing the matter with it for it to be in the trash. It is a very, very cold winter day in January. Thin nightgown, no shoes, standing outside. She sees us approach, and she starts yelling at us something about how we had stolen her dog. We don't really even know about this dog situation completely. Other than what the neighbor said. Starts, yelling at us that, we had taken her dog. She starts yelling profanities at us, and then she goes into the house and slams the door. All right. So at this point, and this is something that a lot of people do not understand in several respects, kind of like when the first officer went to the scene to do the welfare check, we have no right as police officers to make forced entry into someone's house unless we think there's some sort of exigent circumstance. Like if we had went to the door and saw like something on fire on the stovetop or something like that, we could, or if we saw someone laid passed out through a window, we could. But there has to be certain standards for us to make any type of forced entry into someone's house, which is why we've been involved APS. So then we see what we see. She goes in and she slams the door. So before we got to really communicate with her much. So we talked to the neighbor. And basically in talking to the neighbor, you try to explain to the neighbor that, you have a history with this lady, you know more about her baseline. I mean, he's told us everything. We have seen quite a bit for ourselves, backing up that this is a reliable person. But we tell him that he can go petition for an ECO from the magistrate. So that is sort of one way that things can get handled, is for the people that know them the best can try petitioning for ECOs themselves. But what happens often is that the people closest to the individuals that need help, they don't want to go to the magistrate themselves because they don't want to be perceived as the bad guy, or you know, they don't have time to do it, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, but you really, in my opinion, that's kind of sometimes the best, because that's the person who knows the person the best to give the most accurate and best detailed description of the situation. But in most times, a lot of people do not want to do that. They would rather someone else do that. Now, in this particular situation, and I know for law enforcement who deals with this a lot, we are painting kind of in the best scenario sometimes how these things play out. A lot of times I wouldn't have seen her. At that point, I'm kind of stuck because I don't have anything else to go on than what the neighbor is telling me. And that I kind of really have to push the neighbor to do this themselves, because I have no personal knowledge. I haven't seen anything. I have to really try to back up that information in some sort of way. In this case, I was able to back it up independently from what I saw. So in this situation, the neighbor's like, no, I really don't want to. So at that point, you know, me and Taylor, we talk. We're really concerned. It is freezing cold outside. This woman looked like she was freezing cold, you know, turning blue, you know, that type of stuff. So me and Taylor talk, and I'm like, Taylor, I'm going to go and I'm going to try to get an ECO on this situation. In the meantime, if you could try to find me some next to kin other information or anything else you can find on this, I would really, really appreciate that. So kind of at that point is when then I come with a conglomeration of what I've seen myself, what I've been told from the neighbor, and then I present the situation to a magistrate to determine on ECO, and then we're going to hop her just a second to the magistrate portion. As a police officer, I can do an ECO in one of two, well, there's different ways. I can do what's called a paperless ECO. All that means is if she had been out in the yard long enough for me to talk to her face to face, and I could have evaluated her for myself to see if she meets all the criteria for which the magistrate will cover, then I could say, you're coming into my custody, it's an ECO. All right? That's where the CIT training comes into play, where you explain to the person, this doesn't mean arrest, this means you're kind of in my custody, and then you explain, we're going to take you to the hospital for an evaluation, but it is not an arrest. It is a civil process for which I would take them into my custody, and I can do that on my own. I don't need paperwork to do that. It's called a paperless ECO. All right? If I do a paperless ECO, that ECO expires within 8 hours of the time that I say you're under ECO, and we'll get into a little bit more detail with that. That's one way I can do an ECO. Also, I can serve paper ones that other people get, but the way that we're going to do it in this scenario is then I would go and petition, since she slammed the door and I can't get to her to further evaluate her, I would go to the magistrate, and then I would petition the magistrate with my information of trying to get an ECO on Miss Dorothy.
We'll take the low-tech solution. Good afternoon, I'm Magistrate Owens. When an officer comes to me for an ECO, an emergency custody order, it usually means, as Captain Biggs has said, that they have not had enough face time with the person to be able to do the officer-initiated ECO. What a magistrate does, in general, is we're a judicial officer who issue both civil and criminal process. We don't do field work. So that's why I sit down to do the presentation and she wanders off. We conduct hearings in a neutral, independent manner because we stand between the person who is asking for process and the person who is affected by the process. So in this case, a law enforcement officer and Ms. Jones, who will become the respondent. The criteria for issuing an emergency custody order is that a person, and this can be a juvenile or an adult, has exhibited either behavior or expressed in language that they have some intent to harm self or others, and as a result of their mental illness, there's a substantial likelihood that one or the other will occur. The other criteria, which we're talking about in this scenario, is that a person is substantially unable to care for self or to protect self from harm. Not having the capacity not to know walking down a railroad track with a train coming is not a good idea. Or, as we see with Ms. Jones being inappropriately clad for the weather, exhibiting behavior which is very unlike her. She's known to be a gracious neighbor. She's shouting at her neighbors. She's known to be an immaculate housekeeper. There's a smell of garbage. Things are piled up in her kitchen. And for some unknown reason, she's piling personal possessions up in the alley. So it's such a deviation from her normal behavior that her neighbors are concerned enough to call the police. Now, the criteria is the same for a person in the community as for a person in assisted living. A mental illness has been diagnosed. The person is considered dangerous to self or others, which is evidenced by behavior or language, or is substantially unable to care for self or protect self from harm. Generally, in an assisted living facility, this has become because people have become physically aggressive. Now, magistrates will consider not only the written petition and the oral testimony given, but any recommendations of treating physicians or psychologists licensed in Virginia, any past mental health treatment, any relevant hearsay evidence. This is the one time magistrates can take hearsay evidence. From an officer, I can take whatever evidence they give me, but if it's a member of the community, if Dan says Susan told him, or the neighbors told him, I can take that hearsay testimony. I can look at any medical records that are available, any affidavits that are submitted, if the witness is not able to be present, and any other information that I deem to be relevant. When an emergency custody order is issued, it has an 8-hour shelf life. If it hasn't been served by law enforcement within that 8 hours, it simply lapses. Sometimes this happens when we don't know a person's exact location or that person is on the move. I have written emergency custody orders. Last seen in gray Kia sedan, license plate so-and-so, leaving Kmart, or whatever the information is, to give law enforcement as much information as possible to be able to locate the person before the order will actually end. Now, it does appear from the scenario that Ms. Jones lacks capacity to keep herself safe or to provide for her basic needs. So an emergency custody order would be issued and would be sent over to law enforcement for service.
All right, back to me. All right, so it's kind of a popcorn, and anyone's a police officer know that kind of all kinds of stuff comes back and forth to us, back and forth to us. So I now have my paper ECO, and a lot of reason, like, in this situation, I also could have had officers continue to check, see if we could see her outside, that type of stuff. But with the paper ECO, like if I go off duty, it would get handed on to the next shift because they have 8 hours to be able to serve that piece of paper. So even if I am not there to continue to brief everybody on the situation, that kind of stuff, any officer now can serve this paper ECO that they have in hand. So we take this paper ECO and we attempt to go back to the house again. All right, this time when we go to the house, it is the best scenario. She is outside and I am able to correspond with her and tell her that she's being taken under custody of an ECO. All right, one of the things that we are trained in our CIT class is we do have to take them into custody. And different policies of different police departments is their own policies. But for our particular policy in Waynesboro and most of this area, we do not have to handcuff them unless they're violent. And we do sometimes deal with people that are violent and we are attempting to ECO them. But in this situation, for an elderly person who is not violent and being calm and willing to go with me, I would simply just make sure that they don't have anything on their person. We still do have to pat them down, so they're going to go into a car. And then I would, put them in the car. And you explain to them, and there's a paper that is supposed to be given to people that are putting under ECO custody to explain their rights once they are put under ECO custody. We have them at the hospital also, so that they can get copies there. But one of the most important things for the law enforcement to do is the fact that we try to explain the situation. A lot of people get very confused is because it's a police officer doing this. It is not a criminal charge. It is a civil process, which is also why that y'all do need to be aware, because a lot of times, people don't understand what everybody's roles are. And that's why it's good for everybody to get to the same room to know what everybody's rules are. If I had went back with that paper ECO and she had still not been outside where I could talk to her, I cannot make forced entry into her house to serve a paper ECO. I cannot even get a search warrant to go into her house to serve a paper ECO because search warrants are for criminal charges. All right, so I cannot. A lot of people are like, well, why can't you just get a search warrant, go in and serve that first piece of paper? We cannot. All right, so it's not because we don't want to and we're not trying to help and, that type of stuff. We have our roles also. In this situation, we luckily we got her while she was outside and we were able to take her into custody. All right, so once I do that, and kind of a whole process of putting stuff together happens. I let my dispatcher, where's my dispatcher who's still part-time? She knows, as soon as we put someone under ECO custody, they are nice to us. They go ahead and call the hospital and let them know that we're on the way with someone with the ECO. Because we go in a special way so that we're not parading this person through the middle of the ER. All right, that's not good for anybody. Because again, this person isn't a criminal. This is a person that needs help. So we go into a different way. She will let them know that. They also will go ahead and call Valley Community Services for us to let them be on notice that we are on the way to the hospital with an ECO. Because again, the time clock has started ticking, all right? So we try to get this all moving fairly fast because we now have 8 hours to get this person transported to the hospital, checked in, all of that process, and then have a Valley Community Service Board member do an evaluation on them to see, whether they meet the next criteria. So we try to get this as streamlined as possible. Another thing that people do not understand, and I'll get on maybe a little bit of a soapbox here, is that police officers, we stay with this person throughout the 8-hour ECO, throughout the entire, what could be, it says 72 hours, but that does not include holidays or weekends. So if you get this person on a Friday, we are with them there Monday, until Monday, for the TDO process to be completely through. So this person is with a police officer this entire time, which is also why it is super, super important for these officers to have CIT training and to be very, know how to interact and not escalate situations and that sort of stuff. So we really, really push the CIT training for that. So at this point, I've arrived at the hospital. Everyone has been properly notified, and we are hoping that this, situation is going to have a happy ending. So let's find out.
I'm not jumping across this table to be like Captain Weeks. I'm sorry. I am impressed that you are a cheerleader and you are a rock star, but I'm not doing that. So, I am Michelle with the Community Service Board. Let me see if I can move this a little closer. The Community Service Board is the entry point for public mental health in the state of Virginia. There are 40 CSBs across the Commonwealth. Valley Community Service Board services the communities of Waynesboro, Stanton, Augusta, and Highland. We are tasked by code that when an individual is under what's called an emergency custody order, that we will respond to that. Everything, and rightly so, I will say this, everything has a process. And the time frames and the windows of response time are important. So when your dispatcher back there, I'm sorry, I don't know, I just saw a little hand, but we appreciate when dispatch calls and tells us that an officer is en route with Ms. Dorothy. And that way we can respond. Our time frame is a couple hours. However, I do not think that we run against the clock that often. COVID has changed the way in which we do evaluations. We do primarily telehealth evaluations, and we are responding to those evaluations using various means of remote access. So Ms. Dorothy is brought into the emergency department by Captain Beeks or someone on her team. The hospital has been notified that there's an emergency. This lady is an emergency custody order. The doctor will do his initial evaluation. They come in and talk to you. They register her. And then they would start lab work for us. Once we would then respond, we would contact Captain Meeks, talk to her as the petitioner. We would contact other collateral contacts, whether that's, and I'm sorry, what's his name? Dan the neighbor. We would call Dan the neighbor if he wanted to talk. If Miss Dorothy had family, we would contact her family. We would talk to APS as well to get as much collateral information that we could. We would then do our formalized assessment. It is a very standard assessment. Any certified pre-screener across the state has to utilize the same form. To do that, it asks a lot of different questions. If we complete that assessment, we are tasked, just like Captain Mason, I think everyone on this panel, to act in a way that ensures the individual's rights and humanity while protecting the individual and the community. We take that with great responsibility. I don't think there's anyone on my team who would say differently. So when we do our assessment, we want to make sure that we recognize what is the least restrictive option for this individual. Okay, we assess, we note that she has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. She has a history of treatment. She is not currently medication compliant. I think that was stated. She has been acting erratic in the community. She has been not caring for herself. She has been outside when it's extremely cold. She has been belligerent to her neighbors. And we take all that into consideration. We see that there's no additional family that can successfully manage her. She cannot currently maybe engage in therapy because she's pretty ill, it sounds like. So at that time, we know that we probably have a case to request a temporary detention order. Contrary to what people think, The Community Service Board has no authority to issue a temporary detention order. We do not. That does not belong to me. That belongs to these people here. So what we then have to do is, after we've completed our assessment, we will contact the magistrate and we will lay out a case. And I think I would say most pre-screeners start with the understanding of the code, that the person has a mental illness, that the person is either a danger to herself, someone else, or severely unable to care for herself or protect herself in the community. And there is substantial likelihood that these events may occur, and that there is no lesser restrictive measures. And that is what I would testify and provide the evidence to the magistrate. I think that's it.
So once the magistrate has received a petition for a temporary detention order, that petition, the written petition, is reviewed, and you take oral testimony from the petitioner. And in addition to that, I look back at the information provided by the person who got the ECO, any recommendations, if available, from a treating physician or the examining physician, and then make a decision as to whether it meets criteria. Criteria is exactly the same for a TDO as an ECO, with the exception of the input from Community Services Board and that evaluation. Valley Community Services Board is going to find a bed for this person, and we designate,
We tried.
and we designate on the temporary detention order what facility this person is to be involuntarily committed to. In Dorothy Jones's case, she's been found to be incapable or unwilling, and it can be either or both, to admit herself to the hospital. And because she lacks that capacity, then a judicial order may be issued. Now, that then goes to law enforcement to be served, and I am always happy to be able to pass it along to law enforcement, because the Community Services Board has found an alternate transportation provider, and our local law enforcement does not have to send somebody to Petersburg or Hampton Roads or Catawba or Timbuktu, whatever the facility is. So that, that does help out. But then we pass it back to law enforcement for service, and either pass off to the alternate transportation provider or local law enforcement actually transporting the person to the facility. Ms. Jones has met the criteria, it's been issued and delivered.
I guess this is one where I come in. Can you all hear me? I'm used to speaking to one man on Black Road and the second table, and about 13 people on a box, about that same distance. I'll try to speak into this microphone. This is the tail end of Dorothy Jones' story. She has been waiting for 3 days, the maximum period of time until a hearing can be held. The hearing is being held on a regularly scheduled general district court day. And the special justice finds that the standard of clear and convincing evidence has been met. Both that she suffers from a mental illness and that she is unable to properly care for herself in the community. The disposition of that hearing is a 30-day commitment to the mental health board on the hospital. I always take pains to explain to the respondents that they are not being given a 30-day jail sentence. It is a period not to exceed 30 days because if the physicians feel that it's safe for the individual to go home sooner than that, they certainly will do so. A few more things just on the mechanics of those hearings. Really, the first thing that happens is that the respondent gets an opportunity to speak privately with their attorney. We have a panel of attorneys on a rotation basis who represent folks at these hearings. In recent years, we've been doing hearings by Zoom. That just means everyone else present taps the button, turns their video and audio off, and people can talk privately until they wave their hand and say, everybody else come back on. The respondents have the right to have someone else there. Often, they will have a family member give us an email and bring the family member in on Zoom. If we can't do that, we'll get them on the telephone, and the lawyer will hold the telephone up to their microphone on Zoom so that person can have some input. As a special justice, I've got the pre-screening report that was prepared by the CSB. It's very thorough. It provides the tax man part, but it also gives a history of prior hospitalization, prior medication prescriptions. It gives a mini mental status exam of the observation of the CSB worker of the person right at the moment they're meeting with, what their impressions of them are. And usually they have a pretty long narrative where the CSB worker explains everything they know about the person, what experience they've had with them in the past, how they've reacted to different things, what their family life has been like. And then at the end of that report, they make recommendations to whether they recommend the person be hospitalized or whether there is some less restrictive treatment in the community that can help them to meet their needs. In addition to the pre-screening report, we've got two other sources. I'm given the medical records at the time the person came to the emergency room, which, again, thanks to doing these things in Zoom rather than having them jammed up in a real tight schedule, I have time to look through and can learn a lot there. And I also have the recommendation of an examiner who is statutorily required to be at the hearing. The code sets forth various requirements for people to be trained to be examiners. We are fortunate enough in this area that we have clinical psychologists who do it. So I get to listen to clinical psychologists talking to the respondent. I get to hear the respondents' responses. I get to see what their manner is like, hear their voice. When the doctors do, or sometimes I interrupt them, I'll ask a question or two. It's a point that I'm not clear on. But then the doctor makes a recommendation. There is also a community services board representative at the hearing. They also make a recommendation. And you need to remember that there is a difference in time between the TDO and the pre-screening and the actual hearing. 3 days have passed. The person can change in 3 days. The possible outcomes of this hearing are the person could be released, the person could be committed, as Ms. Jones was, a person could be put into a mandatory outpatient treatment program, a person could be involuntarily committed, but required to go into a mandatory outpatient treatment program after they leave the hospital. Or the person could be allowed to sign into the hospital as a voluntary patient if they seem to have the capacity to make medical decisions decisions for themselves at that point. That 3-day period can be very important because in the case of Dorothy Jones, she had previous diagnosis of pneumonia and knew what medication she was taking. When she came into the hospital, she would have been offered her regular medication. If she agreed to take it, she'd been taking it for 3 days before she came to here. Someone who was angry and was offered medication would not accept treatment during that period of time, so their condition wouldn't have changed much. So there's a good chance that people that get an order to stay for a period of time to exceed 30 days don't have to stay that long. Everything up until this point has pretty much been met. My job is to make the legal determination as to whether that standard of clear and convincing evidence has been made. I don't try to do paperwork right at the time of the hearing. I sit down afterward and fill out all the paperwork. And the main document that I sign is called an order for treatment. It's what allows the hospital to treat people when they haven't been able to during that holding period necessarily. That's medical business. I've had the medical stuff explained to him and understand it. But the one thought that goes through my mind every time I put my pen signature on the line on those medical treatment orders is, I'm depriving this person of their liberty for the number of days that are listed. That's something that I think has to be remembered in this whole process.
Thank you, Special Justice McCaskey. Now let's get back to Dorothy and the outcome of the case. So Dorothy, while in the hospital, got back on her regimen of bipolar medication, which had been successful in the past. As part of her discharge treatment plan with Valley Community Services Board, outpatient services were set up and coordinated. Dan gave Dorothy a ride home from the hospital and made sure she got settled. And her friend Susan, who had helped with medication successfully before, agreed to help her with her meds. So how many of you would have a better idea now what to do in a mental crisis? Would you know who to reach out to, who to contact, how to get it started? We're going to switch gears. There's an entirely different animal called medical emergency custody order and medical temporary detention order, and no one better to explain those than Magistrate Owens.
Medical emergency custody orders and medical temporary detention orders work similarly to the mental ones. Custody order is to get the person to the facility in order to receive treatment. The detention is to ensure they stay there long enough to receive observation, testing, or treatment as deemed to be medically necessary. The criteria is very much more specific because not only does a medical ECO or TDO deprive a person of their liberty, the TDO can order the person over their objections to receive medical treatment. As seriously as we take mental health ECO and TDOs, magistrates take medical ones even more seriously. A person whose cognitive ability has been impaired by trauma or illness and is in need of medically necessary testing, observation, and treatment, you'll hear those words a lot, to prevent injury, disability, death, or other harm, may be subject to a medical ECO or a TDO. In order to issue a medical ECO, a magistrate must receive testimony from a licensed physician that an adult person, only adult persons are covered under this section, is incapable of making an informed decision as a result of a physical injury or illness, and that the medical standard of care indicates that testing, observation, or treatment are necessary to prevent imminent and irreversible harm. A magistrate may issue, this is different from mental health, which is shall issue. Shall means we must do it. May means we are authorized and permitted. For good cause shown, any kind of an emergency custody order for a person to be taken into custody and transported to a hospital emergency room for testing, observation, and treatment. Prior to that issuance, the licensed physician must have ascertained that there is no one who has legal authority available to give consent for the necessary treatment, that the person is incapable of making an informed decision regarding the necessary treatment. The person has refused transport, has indicated an intention to continue to refuse transport, and is unlikely to become capable of making an informed decision at a time in which the decision needs to be made. Many medical procedures, as you know, are time critical. So this is one of the elements. The licensed physician may only render that opinion after having attempted, either electronically or personally, to communicate with the emergency medical services personnel on the scene and having attempted to communicate with the person who is in need of treatment. If the physician is unable to get the consent after having attempted to do so, then the medical ECO can be issued. Medical ECOs simply allow law enforcement to take the person to the emergency room. The physician then has the obligation to evaluate the person to see if they meet the criteria for the medical TDO. That evaluation must be done at the ER, and in no circumstances is the emergency custody order to last more than 4 hours. If at any time after the issuance the person becomes capable of making an informed decision, the physician must rely on the patient's decision as to treatment, observation, or testing. If it is found that the person does meet the criteria for a temporary detention order, then the magistrate will receive a petition for the issuance of that order. Now, in this context, a mental or physical condition which impairs informed consent may be intoxication by alcohol or other substances. Magistrates issue ECOs either at any time, but they only have contingent authority to issue a TDO if the court is not available. When is the court not available? Anytime the judge says so. As licensed physician from the ADR calls of the magistrate's office at 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we are obligated to say courts are open. Have you been able to reach a judge? No. You haven't? Is no judge available? If there's been an effort to do so, we just go ahead and issue. If the court calls and says, my staff is gone home, I don't have anyone to read this to writing, I am looking at my code sections, do you mind? I go, Judge, you're unavailable, I'll take care of it. They say, thank you, and we proceed. The TDO is very specific. When we issue a mental health TDO, it's for inpatient treatment. We don't specify what that treatment is, but on a medical TDO, it has to be very, very specific. I know the physicians usually send us from Augusta Health a written petition with their doctors. They don't write very clearly, so I ask often how to spell many of the things that they've written down. A TDO can authorize whatever the physician says the medical standard of care calls for in a particular situation. It can be observation, it can be testing, and it can be treatment. So it's anything from simply making sure the person is alert and awake, to an IV, to a blood draw, drugs, even surgery. In order to issue that, I have to make sure that there is no authorized person to speak for the patient. I have to ask the physician whether anyone has made objections, any family member, and if so, I need to know what the objections are. A standard question is, has your patient given you any religious reasons as to why they have refused any kind of medical treatment? There's a great deal of information to gather as to what the condition to be treated is and how it's to be treated. Last thing I always say to the physician is, think it down the line. Worst case scenario, what do you need to do? Because you're restricted to what I write on this order. Magistrate's orders last for 24 hours. Successive TDOs cannot be written by magistrates. After 24 hours, the physician needs to go to the court. This is problematic when the issue comes up at 5 o'clock on Friday. I can give you until 5 o'clock on Saturday. You're going to have to get a judge out of church on Sunday morning in order to get anything of a greater time span. We do not take these processes lightly. There are time differences in what medical and mental health TDOs and ECOs last. There are criteria differences. Only adults may be under a medical ECO or TDO. And the biggest difference in the two is that if at any time under an ECO or a TDO, a person regains capacity to make informed decisions about their medical health needs. The physician must rely on the patient's decisions. So that is one of the resources that we have within Virginia to help whomever needs the medical treatment.
Thank you, Magistrate Owens. We have built in some time for questions. There's a hand already. What's your question?
So, thank you very much for doing this, by the way. It was really insightful. The question I have is that we oftentimes in APS work with adults who are in a gray area regarding capacity, sometimes for years, and see a very slow decline where they finally reach a point where they are no longer capable of recognizing the risks and the safety issues, such that their behaviors in that moment place them as a danger to themselves and likely to be injured or die. Have you guys found a good way to navigate the law and the policy to handle something like that where there's not a medical emergency, so no hospital is going to admit them, and there's not a history of mental health? So how to actually address this thing that's more related to dementia or cognitive decline over time? Have y'all found a good way to navigate that?
I'll kind of start talking about this and maybe the magistrate can clear it up a little bit more. We get put in this position quite frequently because there are a lot of people in Waynesboro that I would like to be able to ECO because they call us every day, or their neighbor calls us every day about them. And I'm kind of making light of it, but and truly there's situations where people are having mental declines, but unfortunately, if they are not at that level to where we can articulate, and articulate is a big, big, big word with police officers and magistrates and everyone, is if we are not able to articulate that they are, a harm, or that they're sort of in the immediacy that they are going to, not be able to take care of themselves and that sort of stuff, then there's not much we can do. And what people need to understand is, again, understand everyone's rules is helpful so we don't get frustrated with each other. Because before I knew what Valley's rules were, I'd get frustrated, like, well, why didn't they do this and why didn't they do that? So just kind of keep that in mind too. We're on the same team when we're trying to understand everyone's rules. And I kind of learned out, part of this was when we're also working CPS cases, because Lindsay was also CPS for a while. And when you think about like dirty houses, like you go to some older person's house and you can smell the cat urine, and it's certainly not some place where you would like to be having dinner. However, it's not illegal, not for whether it's an older person or a child, to have a dirty house, all right? It truly could be a decline in their normal, but it has to tip that scale pretty significantly because, like he mentioned, we're taking away people's rights. And that is a very big, big deal, and quite frankly, I don't want sued, and I've worked too long to make it this far and get sued. So it has to really tip that scale. So unfortunately, sometimes it's a process, and that's sometimes though where we need the family members to kind of talk to us. I'm gonna come over here and attack y'all guys just because y'all are sitting over here and acting like nobody's paying attention to y'all. We need family members to kind of keep us apprised, and they know more when things are different. They know it needs to come to some sort of standard to where they're not able to take care of themselves, tip that scale. Like they know that they have a blood pressure issue, and they know for a fact that they looked at that blood pressure medication and they haven't taken their blood pressure medicine for a while, something like that. But it can't be, that grandma is, kind of reverting back in time because of her dementia and is talking to her dead husband. Because is that concerning? Yes. But is that going to hurt her? No, it's not going to hurt her. So that's not something that we can deal with. And the same thing is that, I want to know the joke. And the same thing goes with, you know, a lot of things. You can see the decline, but you have to wait till it tips a certain scale to where it meets the threshold. And maybe the magistrate can kind of explain that exact tipping point, because ultimately some of this is the final call for them. I know for an officer I'm looking at, you know, they're going to be, you know, harmful to themselves, not able to take care of themselves. And again, taking care of themselves isn't that they didn't take a bath for a couple of days. Not taking care of themselves is kind of in the situation with Dorothy. She's out cold on a freezing cold day in just her nightgown and that type of stuff. It has to tip a certain scale. And I know that's not sometimes what we all want to hear, and we all have those clients that you're like, I wish there's more than I can do. And honestly, all we can do, that's kind of that wraparound service that needs to come into play. And I know we have a lot of different things. I know we got the police officers, and I saw you roll your eyes when you said alternate transportation was going to be available. We know that doesn't happen very often. So we have, you know, the law enforcement, we have APS that can offer, you know, services. We have, you know, all sorts. What other type of services could we offer these people? This is participation here. Like, tell me something in your field and what you can offer these people. What can you offer? Can you offer someone to come check on them? Can you offer them food stamps? I don't think that's the right word now. EBT, is that right? You know, like, all right, I'm gonna pick on you. What do you do? All right, we got food banks. We got, a lot of times people forget about the private sectors. I have found a new program, and because we also deal with homeless, and sometimes elderly also become homeless situations because they don't get, you know, it's hard with the rent income and being able to pay rent on Social Security. But, you know, you've got churches. We have a lot of churches that have really, I had one personally help me out on a case where I had a homeless person in a wheelchair that I didn't have anything to do with, and this church offered to get a hotel room until we could get some more plans in place. So, I mean, don't forget stuff like that. I mean, and there are the senior centers. Is there anyone here from the senior center? Like, I know we have one like, that you can like, maybe get them involved in some of their type of programs. So sometimes there is no quick and easy answer. It's just kind of the everybody doing everything you can. And maybe she can talk a little bit more about to that tipping line.
Well, let me throw out the scenario, because this may actually help with that too.
All right.
This is a specific scenario that I worked on, but it's certainly not unique.
Right.
So a woman is, we've seen her slow decline. We've seen these behaviors that are concerning, but are not imminent risk.
Okay.
She gets to a place where she is now walking her dog in the road at night, dressed in black, without showing any kind of cognizant awareness of safety issues. She's walking into neighbors' homes. She's walking out of her own neighborhood all times of the night, going into other people's houses, like picking up their packages and stuff like that. She tried to flee from the police by stopping the car in the road to try to get them to get in. She was ECO'd 3 times.
Okay.
Within 1 week. And sent back from the hospital. It had to be driven back from the hospital by the cops 3 times that week.
Right.
The fourth time we went out there, she had set herself on fire.
Oh.
She had a burner that was that electric heater that had 2 wheels broken off the one side and was leaning about 3 inches away, full blast, from a cloth chair. She had a pot on the stove that had about 1/4 inch of water in it that was boiling. And I asked her, what are you making for lunch? Well, I'm not hungry. I haven't had anything to eat yet, and I haven't thought about it. She had no idea what was even there. So we're in this place where there is an imminent risk to her, but she has no mental health history, and she has no, and she has no other medical needs. The other ones are running into too is where maybe the person's not doing something that's dangerous to themselves, but they're so incapacitated because they're dependent on other people for care. And I just had one recently where this woman is bedbound, cannot even drink on her own without assistance, and her husband, it's extensive care. Her husband was doing all by himself and he committed suicide. That happened this week. And so now we're in a place where there's no one to make decisions for this individual. She doesn't need to go to the hospital to be admitted to the hospital because she's got medical needs, but she is absolutely at risk if you don't put that care around her because she can't eat, drink, or even take care of her own body.
Yeah, that was definitely needs care. Go ahead.
There, hopefully what I'm going to say is a little on point of where you're going. Talking to the council, I could about this earlier, but our county attorney has been somewhat cooperative working with us when we run into those situations and working with APS to get them in front of a circuit court judge on a motion to have not been declared completely incompetent, but to declare a level of incompetency based on, like for instance, if they can't take care of their finances or if they're having those types of issues, to have a conservator or a guardian appointed just for that specific reason. And then of course, then they're accountable to the court. We've had 2 cases where that's occurred, and it seemed to be our relative for that particular type of area. Not easy to get the county attorney on board with doing that. They're kind of reluctant to want to take those to do that. I think mainly because they don't want the people in the community to perceive that we're trying to take people's rights away again. But we're having some success with that on some problems like that.
People out there hear that? Basically, one of his solutions was having the person deemed basically incompetent through the court. That is a hard process. Again, none of these processes are easy, but that is one process. In your first scenario, you talked about how this lady had been ECO. Sure.
I really don't.
Take the mic, dear.
Well, hello everybody. Deputy Ronnie Kester with the Orange County Sheriff's Office, formerly retired Albemarle County PD. I have 41 years of service. And my primary job right now is to work with the elderly in long-term capacities. But in a situation that we spoke about earlier, was unbeknownst to her, was almost a mirror of the situation you talked about. The lady that we had, 73 years old, was getting evicted from an apartment. The reason why she was getting evicted was because it was full of roaches and bed bugs that had spread into other people's apartments. APS was involved. We knew from APS that she had not been to the doctor, that she was off her bipolar medications and also off of her diabetes medications. The morning that she was evicted, and she had no family and nowhere else to go, she was eaten up with bed bugs, she was in a thin gown, and she could not understand, even though we've been explaining to her for a month that she was being evicted. I had rescue standing by because I felt like we were going to be in an ECO situation. I ended up in talking to her and determining that she was, in my opinion, a danger to herself because she wasn't taking her medications, and she obviously had not paid any attention to her hygiene, and she hadn't eaten in over a week. So I ECO'd her immediately upon arriving at the hospital because of the bed bug infestation. She had to be decontaminated in an outside chamber, which I had never seen done before. Subsequent to that, went into the emergency room, and when the community service board got involved, and God, I wish you had been the community services board person that day, via iPad, and after talking to me and talking to APS and listening to basically the same criteria that you laid out, the community service board worker kind of zeroed in on, do you feel like hurting yourself? Have you said you're going to kill yourself? Have you said you're going to make harm to anybody else or kill anybody else? And that seemed to be where they got stuck. The fact that she wasn't taking medication, the fact that she was eating up with bugs, the fact that she hadn't eaten, didn't seem to register with this community service board person. Subsequently, less than 2 hours after I had her at the hospital, he released her from the ECO. Luckily, the medical staff was on board with treating her. Unfortunately, what I'm seeing, and what I have seen for several years in several different jurisdictions, is the reluctance of TDOs to be issued if the person has not expressed a specific intent to do harm to themselves through either suicide or hurting some other person. So I'm kind of interested in what your opinion on that is, and And how do we rectify that? Because obviously a person who's not taking their medications in this situation, and as the one you described, is in need of some mental help. So thank you, I appreciate that.
Captain,
Before I turn it over, I'm going to,
if I can address something that you said, and we couldn't go over every facet of the process, but if the original petitioner disagrees with the recommendation of the Community Services Board, there is an avenue for that petitioner to get in contact directly with the magistrate and to go outside of the Community Services Board. Would you address that, Michelle?
Yeah, so a couple things. I think there, and this is me, I'm not representing the Community Service Board in this moment. I believe that when you look at what they call prong 2, which is inability to care for self, that is a very gray area, right? Like, so you can have my grandpa who refuses to take his insulin. You and I both know that could be a deadly option, right? Like, you know, could I say he has mental health issues? I could, but really walking that line of what is like legally and ethically correct is hard.
So to go for just a second.
Yeah.
I agree with you 100%, except she had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and having lived with that with my mother, I know how that kind of finish process to make those decisions. So
Yeah, I think I would say to you, I think, and I can't speak specifically to that case because I wasn't there, but maybe there was a lesser restrictive, maybe the thought of, is there substantial likelihood that this person, you know, is so incapacitated that she could not live? Like, you know, she has bed bugs. It's kind of like, Mr. McCaskey, if I can use this example, sometimes we talk about people's rights to be mentally ill and homeless. It breaks my heart, right? Like, going downtown and not just to see people homeless, it hurts me. But they have the right to be homeless. Now, there are other things, other standards we look at, but there's that, it is so hard. So I can't speak directly to that case because I wasn't the speaker, I was not there. Now what, I'm sorry, I'm going to call you Magistrate Hailey because you'll always be Magistrate Hailey to me. So what Magistrate Hailey was mentioning was you as a petitioner have the ability, and actually as a community service board clinician, I have to afford you that opportunity by law to contact the magistrate and disagree with me.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
I don't know if ever told me that.
It does exist. I think it's probably
You learn something,
the
see?
last 10 years that has come up.
You might want to mention that to the CSB for your area, because the pre-screener is mandated by
It is
law
required.
to inform you of that.
That is correct.
I've never had a screener.
That is-
In 41 years, I've never
It is a relative, when I say relative, COVID has messed with my brain. It's relatively new, probably within the last few years, that you get TDO over, it's kind of a weird TDO over objection, you know? But literally, you as a petitioner have the authority to contact Magistrate Owens, and it happens to us
So,
sometimes.
from a jurisdictional standpoint, is that the magistrate in the jurisdiction in which I came from, or the magistrate in which jurisdiction I happen to be in at the time?
So
That would be the magistrate who would be hearing the petition from the Community Services Board.
How would you know who that is?
If you would have petitioned, you would have been in communication.
No, it was a on-site ECO. So it's a paperless ECO. I'm now in Culpeper County, outside of my jurisdiction tomorrow. So which magistrate am I going to appeal to?
You would talk to the magistrate in the jurisdiction in which the person is located for an ECO.
Okay,
So you would go to the magistrate
It would
in
be
that
called.
locality.
okay,
In that locality.
okay.
petition for an
I
ECO?
didn't know if it would mean that it would have to be one in which you took them, if they were a resident or whether.
ECOs are always issued to the law enforcement agency in the jurisdiction in which the person is located. TDOs are issued to the law enforcement agency in the jurisdiction in which the person makes their residence.
Gotcha. So I would go to the magistrate and ask for
An ECO,
an ECO.
yes.
But there are-
Because when the pre-screener releases the ECO,
Right.
it's gone.
Okay.
So you would ask for an ECO, that would, and the magistrate can rely on the pre-screen evaluation that has been done within the last 96 hours. Petitions last 96 hours. And consider that information in order to issue any further process.
So if my community services board worker is denied issuing a TDO or going forward to try and get, and I disagree with that, I go to the magistrate, I want to ask for a TDO, then they're gonna contact the.
That's right,
that just got done,
the spiral starts again.
and that screen's gonna say, I didn't find any cause, and there's something.
Then that gives you standing as the ECO petitioner to ask for a TDO
Okay.
when the pre-screener has found not to meet criteria.
Gotcha.
Now, if the magistrate issues the TDO under that situation, the pre-screener or the community services board is obligated to find the bed.
You know, they are tasked to find the bed. Typically what we'll do is we'll call up the state hospital and say, we've got this issue here, we will search for a bed, but we want to let you know that this has happened. And I think in my years, and I've been doing it almost 10 years, I've seen this happen 2 or 3 times in our jurisdiction.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Great questions.
And I'll just spin there.
The gentleman-
My point for bringing this up was not to say that the CSP is not doing their job. They have a set of rules they have to follow.
Yes,
I
sir.
think that we're getting into a situation here, especially as the age wave is progressing, tidal wave, where we have this set of dynamics that the law doesn't speak to.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. We have run out of time for our purposes here. I want to keep everybody right on schedule. We'll be glad to speak to anyone who has further questions during the break. And it was a privilege to assemble this team. Give these guys a hand for anyone who's stopped. Thank you.